So I'll hand it over to Chinmay now.
Thank you. So thank you IIHS for having me over. It's fantastic to be here. I think IIHS is slowly becoming a sort of mecca for urban research. So it's like a tick mark on, for me to come here and present. I presented at CEPT and all these other places, and IIHS was the ultimate destination. So thanks for having me over. This is a very exciting project. It combines two of my research interests, one in urban economics, the other in economic history. And what I'm going to try and show are some sort of stuff about urban growth, urbanization, which we've taken for granted, but really testing these standard sort of commonsensical assumptions and having a different orientation or interpretation of these phenomena. It starts from these three stylized facts. Okay, now the first point, so three Indian urban mysteries. The first one, India is urbanizing not rapidly but slowly. Okay, when I wrote my research grant, I said rapid urbanization in India, etc., etc., etc. Right? Every newspaper article that you read is about rapid urbanization. Okay, what India is facing is rapid urban growth. Okay, which is very different from rapid urbanization. Okay, and that is what the difference of what I'm going to be speaking about. Of course, now there's a definitional issue. So India is today 31% urban. You change the definition, it goes to 50%. But that doesn't change the argument, as you will see, of the change in the pace of definition. So if you use the same definition across time, there's no doubt that India is urbanizing very, very slowly, especially compared to China, Nigeria, Ghana, variety of countries in the world. The second, not so well-known stylized fact is of a north-south divide now, okay, between the hinterland, the poorer hinterland of the north, that is the so-called Bimaru states, and the south, the 4 or 5 southern states. And what's interesting here is that urban growth today is higher in the north relative to the south, but the south is urbanizing faster than the north. Okay, so this is also a seeming paradox. The north is having rapid urban growth but slow urbanization. The south is having slow urban growth relatively but faster urbanization. So we need an explanation for this. Third, from an economist point of view, there are fairly large rural-urban wage gaps in India. Some have estimated this to be in the range of 30 to 40%. It has been declining over time, but even today there are substantial wage gaps. One argument, there's one paper recently which argues that there's not enough migration in India to take opportunity of these rural-urban wage gaps. So you have slow urbanization. The answer is why? The question is why? The answer is because of no migration. Now, as someone working on migration for the last 5 to 10 years, this argument doesn't seem very valid to me. There's a substantial amount of migration, but the nature of migration is important, and that's what we'll be arguing explains this third conundrum. So our argument is very simple. We developed two sort of conceptual terms, as you can see out here, and I'm going to use this presentation to outline what I mean by these terms. So the first is called the demographic divergence. This divergence, as you will see, is between fertility rates, basically birth rates, okay, between rural and urban areas. And this explains a large part of these conundrums that we see in Indian urbanization today. The second, what I'll argue, is that India's urbanization is fairly unique compared to the world in that it's very, very masculine in nature. In India, we take it for granted that there are more men in cities than women, but this is actually an anomaly across the world. Okay? In most of the world, you have more women in cities relative to men. And why this has happened, one of the sort of conceptual sort of terms that we're trying to build out here is what we are calling as remittance urbanism. There is a lot of cities of India, the people are not settling down in the cities but going back. There's a whole culture of remittances which has built, whereas you're not investing in the city but investing back home. So you migrate to a city not to engage with the city in some way, but to engage back home, and the city is just a point for your earning and sending back money home. And I'll sort of elaborate this point further, but this is the broad crux of this presentation. So India has had fairly slow pull away from agricultural employment. This is a chart which shows urbanization with the percentage of workforce in agriculture, and India starts from here, it goes only here. Each dot is a country, and this is a trail for China, the blue dots, and you see that China has sort of pulled away more people off farms than India, though they started at the same point in about the 1970s. And the question is, why is this sort of happening? If you look at the level of urbanization of India and look at a cross-country sort of comparison, you'll see that India is fairly well below the predicted level of income. So for its level of income, the 31% sort of definition seems to be too low. Now there's a lot of research being done, some at IIHS, some at other places, questioning this whole definition of urban. Even we question the definition of urban. India is not 31% urban. But there is no doubt that India is urbanizing slowly. So yes, you might bump up this figure from here to here, here to here, right? But the change in urbanization is it is still very, very slow, irrespective of the definition. Okay, so you see that in this chart, we use different definitions of urbanization in India. So you have the official definition where India goes from 27 to 31 between 2001 and 11. And then you use a definition which says, okay, let's take all the villages of India with more than 10,000 population and let's consider them to be urban. You bump up 31 to 37. You can bump it up further to 47 if you take villages more than 5,000. A lot of villages in Bihar, UP have population of more than 5,000, right? The thing is, you can bump up the urbanization figure, but then you need to use the same definition to work out urbanization in the previous year as well, right? And when you do that, you find that there's virtually no change, right? So irrespective of the definition, there's roughly a 3 to 4 percentage point sort of difference between 2001 and 11. So India is urbanizing at a rate of 3 to 4 percentage points per decade, whereas China is at about a rate of double. Most other countries are at double this rate. Okay, so this is an important point. So what I'm saying is not that India's urbanization rate is low, but its pace of urbanization, that is the rise in this particular statistic, is very low, irrespective of the definition. Okay, so that's one point. So the question that we're asking is, why is India not urbanizing rapidly? Okay, and what we bring in this research is that researchers so far have sort of overlooked the importance of the demographic transition. Okay, so when you think of urbanization, you're almost always thinking of migration, right? But there's also other factors at work, mainly fertility and mortality, and we're trying to get those components in out here. This other question we asked related with this is, why are some cities growing faster than the others? Okay, so Bangalore grew at about 4% per annum in the last 10 years. Kolkata grew at 0.7%. Okay, a huge difference. Okay, the difference, if a city is growing at 1%, it doubles in size in about 70 years. If a city is growing at 3%, it doubles in only about 20 years. So these 1%, 2% make a huge difference. Okay, so we're trying to ask, why are some cities growing faster than the others? And for both these questions, we argue that the demographic transition and the way it's being played out in India, due to certain factors, has a lot of significance. So the data that we collect for this exercise is fairly extensive. We first look at the vital statistics, birth rates, death rates. This is only at the state level, so we get for rural and urban, but it's an annual time series. So you have an annual time series for about 40 years, 45 years. In fact, this data ends at 2013. So the census has only 2011, but this goes 2 years further than that. And with this, you can actually see how rural and urban natural growth rates have tracked at the regional level. We then develop a fairly unique database from every census document that was ever there. Right? So from 1872, the first census, 1881 was the first all India synchronous census, till 2011, in the jurisdiction boundaries of broadly, not very, very accurately, but broadly 2001. We do this by linking two major databases. The census has a particular book called Table A4. Ashok Mitra, census official, long back, he had written a book which had these estimates from 1872 to 1971. So we link these two books. We go back to the old census documents themselves, fill in the sort of missing details. And so for about 350 urban agglomerations, we have the population. Okay, and these are urban agglomerations. So I'm sure you know the difference. In Kolkata municipal corporation is very small. It's only about 30% of its urban agglomeration. And an urban agglomeration includes about 100 municipalities of Kolkata. So this Kolkata UA is just one unit across time. Right? So you have for about 15 census periods data on just population out here. Then for about 4,000 urban units, which is the roughly this full sample of towns in 2001. In 2001 there were about 5,000 odd towns. So when you collapse the UA town units, you get about 4,000 UA plus towns. And so for that we have a database from 1901 to 2011, again on population, but from 1961 you also have information on area, and there's some other demographic sort of features that we get. And then for 3 time periods, we collect information at the district level. So 1901 census, so for example, there's some districts which haven't changed borders. Bellary district, Anantapur, last 110 years, the borders are pretty much the same. Whereas a lot of districts, the borders have changed. Okay, so we have we build a concordance kind of a table linking districts from 1901 to now. So most districts have been cleanly carved. Where they haven't, we do some adjustments. But at the district level, we are able to sort of capture information on literacy rates, urbanization at a much sort of finer granulated level. Okay, so this is the historical sort of data that's coming into the picture. And this is important because you'll see that at the district level, so a lot of the UAs are themselves districts. Like Mumbai is a district, Kolkata is also a district, Delhi has 9 districts within them, etc. And then we collect a lot of other information. So the railways expansion, most of that expansion happened between 1870s and 1910. So we code districts whether it had a railways or not. We look at road maps, a lot of other sort of geographic information which we collect along the way. Right, just to quickly give a quick synopsis of urbanization. India is here today, 31% starting from 1901 to 2011, but there are huge regional variations. Right? So Tamil Nadu's urbanization rate trebles from about 15% to nearly 50%. Bihar's is from 5% to 10%. Okay, so massive regional variations in urbanization. Using the sort of definitions have been broadly consistent from 1961. There's some sort of issues before that. And if you look at the urbanization map today, you'll find that there's sort of distinct clusters along particular routes. You have the Tirupur, Coimbatore cluster here, you have the Bombay, Ahmedabad cluster here, you have Delhi cluster here, Jaipur, etc. And you'll see this vast blank space out here, which is not very urban. In fact, it's fairly agrarian. So even when you look at the workforce data, it's highly agrarian. Though they're very dense and large settlements, they're very agrarian. And if you look at state, the transition of urbanization rates across time, you'll find that the same states which were fairly urban in 1901 continue to be so today. So there's a huge regional persistence over time. So for example, if you just were to ask the question, 2011, why are some states more urban than the others? 50% of that variation can be explained by the urbanization rates in 1901. Okay, so this initial starting advantage has a huge impact on future urbanization. So you'll see that these lines barely cross. Each line is a particular state. There are about 18 major states. India is also unique in the sense that typically we have associated urbanization with manufacturing, industrialization. India has had a completely different story. In 2001, virtually no districts of India, Surat is one exception where you have a thriving manufacturing sector in its urban areas, but in all the other districts, this is a distribution of districts, all the other districts, the service sector is, more than 80% of the people are working in the service sector. Okay? So that's a very important economic feature of India's cities. Now this is a chart showing you sex ratios, urban sex ratios versus rural sex ratios across countries. So each dot out here represents a country, and you'll see that most countries in the world have relatively more feminine sex ratios in urban areas relative to rural areas. In fact, there's a paper called Sex and the City which argues that this is because of marriage markets working in a particular way. But India is an outlier. India falls below this line, and the few other countries out here from the Middle East. Within India, there are some cities which are extremely masculine in terms of the sex ratio, but across India, most districts exhibit this feature, relatively more masculine urban sex ratios vis-a-vis rural. So for example, this is a chart showing districts of India. It's the same chart, but now this is a cross-country dot. So each dot out is a country, each dot out here is a district. And you'll see that while most countries lie above the line, which means more feminine urban sex ratios, in India it's the complete reverse. Right? So most districts lie below this. And you have some points out here which are extremely, extremely masculine. So this also needs some sort of an explanation. If you look at the major cities of India and how their sex ratios have evolved over time from 1901, in 1901, Mumbai and Kolkata were basically male cities. Sex ratio of 500 females per 1,000, virtually no women compared to men in those cities. And over time, they've increased not so much because migration patterns have changed, but because there's been internal growth of cities. That is, people who settled in cities had kids, and so that balanced out the sex ratio. But if you see the migration component, it continues to be overwhelmingly male dominated. Okay, so when you look at the actual, the sex ratio of the migrants themselves, it has improved very, very little over time. Okay, so this evening out is not because migration streams became more male dominated, but because of natural growth. So they have more daughters being born in cities to stabilize this sex ratio. And you'll see cities which sort of started growing very fast recently, like Surat, has a plunge in the sex ratio precisely because more male migrants started going there. Okay, these are just 4 major cities. Bangalore, Hyderabad do not exhibit such features. The last point on urbanization is it has a very close relationship with income in India. Okay, across country the relationship is a bit tenuous, but within India there's a very straight relationship between urbanization and per capita income. It also has a clear relationship with income growth. So relatively more urban regions in 1971 also experience faster income growth later on. Okay, so it's not just levels but also in changes. So this is just a quick synopsis of what we already know. Broadly, most of these things are already known. Now what we're going to try is connect two major processes. Okay, urbanization, which is the process of more people living in cities and towns, and demographic transition, which involves a process of societies moving from high birth and death rates to low birth and death rates. Okay, and both these processes in a way are the most stylized, you can say the most, in terms of an empirical regularity, it has occurred or is occurring in virtually every society. But research connecting these two processes is surprisingly very scant. It's only in the last 10 years that some sort of research papers have appeared to connect these two processes in a more strong manner. Now, if you look at how India has fared in the demographic transition, this is just a quick synopsis of that. Before 1921, you'll see that the birth rate and death rate is the blue line and birth rate is the red line, they were the same. This is the starting point of the demographic transition, high birth rates, high death rates. And you have high death rates because of plague, because of epidemics. 1917, 18, you had the influenza, you had rainfall-induced famines, etc., etc. And from the 1921 census, you'll see that the death rate is basically falling. Okay? And birth rate takes time to adjust to falling death rates. And so in between, what happens is that the population starts growing. So in the 70s, there was a lot of concern about the population explosion. There's a book, the Population Bomb, which was a bestseller. And that's because natural growth rate started to increase. So at this peak in roughly the 1980s, India was growing at about 2.2% per annum population, okay, which means it was doubling its population roughly every 30 years. Okay, and now it is on its sort of downward path, which means India is now growing at about 1.6%. That's the green. So this U-shaped curve is the demographic transition. Okay. Now, this demographic transition has taken place at different sort of paces across India. This is also a well-known fact. South India today is at a much sort of end position of the demographic transition than the north. Okay, so you have much lower birth rates and death rates in Kerala, for example, than in Bihar. Okay, Bihar is naturally growing at about 2%. Kerala is naturally growing at about 1%. That's a huge demographic difference. Okay, so there is one. This is not the divergence I am talking about. That is a demographic difference between north and south. If you see states across India, you'll see each line out here represents a state over the last 40 years. You'll see that fertility differences have persisted. So in the 1970s, there was some difference across states, and that has broadly persisted over time. Okay, this is an annual data series, so that's why it looks very jagged. But you'll see that mortality rates have converged. Okay, which means that what explains the difference of natural growth rates across states is not mortality. Mortality rates are pretty much the same across states of India. Okay, because you have better health systems across the board, newer vaccination policies, etc. Okay, but fertility differences have varied. Okay, so in the rest of my presentation, I'm going to focus on fertility because mortality rate convergence is broadly taking place. So when some region is growing naturally higher than another region, it's almost entirely due to fertility. But there has been a divergence, or what we are calling as the demographic divergence, between rural and urban areas. Okay, and this is the most important chart of this talk. What this means is that there's one divergence or one difference between the south and the north. South is growing slower because of lower fertility rates than the north. But what we are finding is this, okay, that in the 1970s, the rural and urban areas had the same natural growth rates. Okay, if you ever do fieldwork in rural India, you'll quickly realize both death rates and birth rates are higher in rural areas than in urban areas. Okay, so what matters is the difference, the natural growth rate. And in the 1970s, they were the same. The green line is the rural and the red line is urban. In the 1970s, rural areas and urban areas were both naturally growing at the same rate. Okay, since then, there's been a divergence. Okay, and that divergence is very stark now. It's a full half percentage point. Right. So today, and this is 2013, which means it's very, very recent data. Okay. Today, left on its own, rural areas are naturally growing much, much faster than urban areas. What this means is that in the absence of migration, in the absence of reclassification effects, India is not, forget rapid urbanization, India is de-urbanizing. Okay. It's a very important point to sort of emphasize out here because we've taken urbanization to be granted. Right. So where if migration was not there, India will actually be de-urbanizing simply because of this demographic difference, okay, which was not the case in the 1970s, but it has appeared today. right? So we want to dig this phenomenon further. We want to know what's happening here, why is this being caused, okay? And this is very important because this, as we'll see, very, very easily explains India's slow urbanization. So you now don't need an explanation of migration to explain slow urbanization. You have an explanation rooted in the demographic transition itself. Okay. So let's look at this phenomenon a bit closer. Okay. This divergence does not take place in the south. Okay. In the south, rural and urban areas are both growing naturally at the same time, and you see these lines track each other beautifully across 40 years. Okay. So the 4 southern states, so this is the all India chart, right, where you see the divergence, and there's the same lines but for South India, and you don't see any divergence. In Tamil Nadu, actually, the red line is slightly higher, which means urban areas were naturally for some time growing faster than rural areas, which means in the absence of migration, Tamil Nadu urbanized much faster purely on account of this demographic factor. Okay. So this is basically showing you a non-migration factors related with urbanization. So where is this all India divergence coming from? It's coming from the north. It's not coming from Punjab, it's not coming from Haryana, they have the same charts. It's not coming from Maharashtra, it's not coming from Gujarat, they also have the same charts. Okay. So it comes from these states, okay, where you see this divergence. And note again that everywhere except for West Bengal, they're starting from the same rates in the 1970s. So this is a 40-year-old story. In the last 40 years, these lines have diverged for these major states. Okay. And because these states are very populous, it's reflected in the all India figure as well. Okay. So you see in Rajasthan and UP and Bihar, in Assam and Madhya Pradesh, and this includes Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, all the states which are created out of them. And you'll see this divergence across the board. Right? In West Bengal, you don't see a divergence, you see a difference. Okay? And that is because Kolkata already was a city with one of the lowest fertility rates in the 1960s. And because Kolkata is a huge part of urban West Bengal, it sort of explains this big gap even in the 1960s. Okay? But apart from this Kolkata effect, you'll see that in these major states, there's been this major divergence. So we want to understand what factors potentially lead. So why is it the case that in the south, these rates fell at the same time, and it's only in these states where it does not happen. So the obvious candidate explanation is in agriculture, because you need an explanation for something which is happening in rural areas vis-a-vis urban areas. Okay, so agriculture is mainly in rural areas, it is not happening in urban areas. So we look at agricultural yields at the district level. Okay, and this is a picture of the demographic divergence. Okay, so we look at rural-urban differences in fertility measured by the child-woman ratio, and you'll see all the hotspots are basically Rajasthan, Bihar, UP, Madhya Pradesh, and so on. This is useful also because this comes from the census, whereas the earlier charts came from the SRS. So there are 2 different data sets telling you the same story, okay, which is also useful in terms of external validity of data. Right? So 2 completely different data sets telling you the same story. There's also a small region here which has a demographic divergence. Okay, what this means is that in these districts, the urban areas are growing much, much faster than the rural areas, purely on account of natural reasons, that is births minus deaths. Okay. Now this map, if you've done a course in agriculture or agriculture economics, is very similar to the map on agricultural yields. Okay, this is also the belt of India where agriculture has stagnated. Okay, if you see Haryana and Punjab, they benefited immensely from the Green Revolution. Other areas, not so much. Okay. So we built a simple model trying to explain the demographic divergence in terms of other factors. So if you don't like the math, I'll just follow these words out here. Okay. Higher agricultural yields, our argument, lowers rural fertility due to an income effect. It's the most stylized fact in the fertility literature. The richer you are, the fewer kids you have. Okay. And because agricultural yields have stagnated in these particular sections, okay, rural fertility has not fallen. Across the board, fertility is falling, but not at a very fast pace. Okay. So what we are saying is that agricultural yields, the stagnation of agricultural yields has led to a slowdown in the pace of fertility reduction in particular regions of India, which is slowing down the pace of fertility reduction in rural areas compared to urban areas. Okay. Which means India's urbanization, so there's a lot of migration happening, okay, there's a lot of migration happening, but India is still not urbanizing very fast because there are still more people coming up in the rural areas relative to urban areas. Okay. Let me put it differently. India's slow urbanization, we are saying, is we have rapid urban growth, but villages themselves are growing very fast. Okay. And now I think you'll try and understand this north-south variation. So what this means is that in the north, cities are growing faster than the south because cities in the north, as you'll see in a while, have higher fertility rates. Okay? But because the villages in the north are also growing very fast, the region as a whole is not urbanizing. Whereas in the south, the villages and the cities are growing at the same rate. Okay? So this is the basic sort of, this explains the paradox of this north-south divide. So we run also a simulation to see how much does the demographic divergence matter. So we say that if you close the demographic divergence today, it gives you a boost to the urbanization rate by about 4 to 5 percentage points. Okay? So this is irrespective of definition. So if you use the definition of 48, India's urbanization will be 53. Okay? So that's sort of that is the kind of impact it has on the urbanization. Now the next question that we sort of move on to is urban growth. Okay? So you look at urbanization, the question why is India urbanizing slowly? We say is rooted in factors in the rural side, and this is important because we're trying to understand urbanization with the rural side explanation. Now we're going to look at urban growth per se, which we know has been fairly rapid. It's been growing at about 2.5%, and this is a contribution of natural increase versus migration and reclassification effects. And you'll see that the black shaded line, which is natural increase, is sort of falling over time, but very nicely with the movement in the demographic transition. So you saw the earlier chart on the demographic transition, natural increase was falling, and that's what you see in the contribution to urban growth as well. Okay, which means that in future, if migration is at the same rate in the future, then this black line, which is the contribution of natural increase to urban growth, should be falling over time. Okay, and so migration will now have a higher weightage, not because migration rates have changed, but purely because of lower fertility in cities. Right? So the next thing that we start sort of exploring is how has city growth rates gone over time. So we looked at this sample of 350 odd urban agglomerations from this sample from 1872 to now, and we break it down into 4 time periods. Okay, so we look at the colonial era in 2 time periods, one before 1921. 1921 is a nice period because major famines and all sort of stop after that, and we look at this period just before independence, and you'll see that in the first period, right, the annual, so the x-axis is the annual city growth between 2 time periods. You'll see that in the x-axis, it's basically roughly 0. What this distribution is, it's a distribution of cities. Okay, so most cities in this time period, 1881 to 1921, the annual growth rate was 0. They didn't grow. You had about 50% of cities which declined and 50% of cities which actually increased. Okay, and that distribution shifts to the right as the demographic transition kicks into place. Okay, so because now there's more natural increase, birth rates have fallen, fertility rates have not fallen. Okay, so this entire distribution falls. And note in this period, there's still a few cities which are less than 0, which means there were a few cities which actually declined in population. Okay. Now, as the demographic transition takes sort of more steam, this distribution shifts even further. Okay, and these cities form roughly 60 to 70% of urban India. So it's a fairly large chunk of urban India. You can do this even with the 4,000 units, it gives you the same results. So this distribution shifts over time, and this is again because we argue because of the demographic transition. So natural growth rates are picking up. So cities are now growing at a faster rate. So of course, what's of more importance to us is what's happening now, right? So has this distribution shifted to the right, stayed there, or come back? And we find that it's actually shifted to the left. Okay. So in the last 20 years, cities have been growing slower. Okay, many of us have this impression that cities are bursting at the seams when you look at cities like Bangalore, etc. But cities in India are growing slower today than they were in the past. Past meaning over 30 years back. Okay, if you see the distribution, there are still a few cities out here which are growing extremely fast. Surat is growing at about 5%. Tirupur is growing at about 6% annually. Right. So that's what takes the distribution here. But the bulk of the cities, okay, they have shifted to the left, okay, which means that city sort of growth distribution, you saw it shifting across 3 time periods, and now it's going back, okay, very nicely along the demographic transition. Okay, so this is putting all the graphs on one page. So starting from the green line, it shifts here, and now shifting back. Okay, so the average city of India is now growing slower than what it was in the past. Okay. This is just to get a sense of how cities look like in 1901. These are state boundaries today, so this is not about this is not the political map of India in 1901. But if you see the population, you'll see that Mumbai, Kolkata, Chennai, the 3 port cities of the British Empire in India, were the main sort of urban hubs in India. And you'll see that Delhi is nowhere on the map. You'll see also a lot of sort of blue dots out here, which are the sort of medium-sized towns in 1901. And by 2011, this map has changed substantially in the sense that the main difference, of course, now Delhi is a huge dot on the map. So you now have, so out here you had one triangle, the Mumbai, Chennai, Kolkata triangle, and now you have two triangles. You have the, Delhi, Bombay, Calcutta triangle, and you have a smaller triangle, which is the sort of Hyderabad, Bangalore, Chennai triangle. Okay. Now this is important because one of the things that we document later is that cities in India tend to grow faster the closer they are to a large metropolitan city. Okay. And so that is another reason, because of the growth of these three sort of cities, okay, that you find that a lot of small towns, etc., have grown fast in this particular region compared to this. So I'm not going to show you a lot of the statistical analysis, but broadly we have a sort of growth regression model trying to break down city growth across this large period. So we find that there are firstly robust agglomeration effects, what geographers, economists call as agglomeration effects, which means that towns and cities closer to the urban agglomeration are growing faster, and the further you go away from a major metropolitan city, the growth rates start declining. We find a strong British rule effect. India was not entirely British rule. 60% of the land area was British rule, and the rest was what is known as indirect rule. We were living in a place which was under indirect rule. We find that cities which were in districts with direct British rule grew much faster, okay, in this particular period of the colonial era, showing a very strong sort of colonial impact, the colonial economic impact on city growth. After that, we document strong capital city effects before 1991. Okay, again, this idea of a strong state driving city growth until 1991. Okay, and in the last 20 years, you don't find capital cities growing at a faster or slower rate than non-capital cities. In recent years, we find that IT investment, okay, explains about 10% of the variation in the growth of cities. Now, when we think of IT investment, the variable that we use is the share of workforce in the IT sector, okay, the communications and computer related activities. And this is data is available for 2001 at the city level. So Bangalore is the highest, about 4% of the workforce in 2001. Then you have Hyderabad, Chennai at about 4.5%, 3%. But what's interesting is that across the board, about 400 cities, just one variable. So wherever IT investment took place, right, there was a lot of sort of growth in cities. Now we know, if you ask a question, why is Bangalore the silicon sort of hub of India, or why did IT investment pour into India? Standard sort of urban history would tell you that a lot of factors at play, politics, economics, etc. But human capital was major. Right? So you had a lot of engineering institutes, you had a lot of human capital at work drawing this investment there. Right? Much of the literature on city growth in the West has almost entirely the discourse of there has been sort of dominated by human capital, okay, by which we mean education, innovation, etc. What we find is something very, very interesting in India. In the West, in the literature in the US, for example, city growth is almost completely sort of explained by human capital. So cities which are very educated have more economic growth, so they draw in migrants, and hence city population growth rates are higher. In India, you find a completely mixed effect. What's happening is you have a city like Bangalore, largely educated workforce. Between 1991 and 2001, more than 50% of the migrants to Bangalore came from other urban areas. Okay, so they were not coming from rural areas; they were coming from other urban areas to Bangalore. So it has the skill composition of the migrants is much, much higher. So Bangalore, you'll say, is the classic example of human capital driving migration and Bangalore's growth. It turns out, of course, that human capital also has a negative effect, okay, because the more you're endowed with human capital, fertility rates fall. Okay, so Bangalore also has fairly low fertility rates. Okay, so you have these two contrasting effects. You have on the one hand high levels of education drawing in migrants, but you have high levels of education also having fewer kids in the city. So you have lesser natural growth but more migration. So there are two contrasting effects at work. Okay, so we look at this in slightly more detail. So we break down, so we have this 2 by 2 kind of matrix. This is what happens when you move to a business school. You start putting everything in 2 by 2 matrix. So if you look at fertility and migration, so you can think of fertility as a proxy for natural increase, because mortality rates across cities broadly the same. High, low, and this is also low, high. So if cities have internal growth, there's not much migration, but there's very high fertility rate. So city is growing internally. Okay, vis-a-vis external growth, which is on the other end of the spectrum. And then you have a city, which is low on both counts, which is not really growing in population. And then you have sort of explosive cities with high migration and high this. What's interesting is if you look at the direction, because of the demographic transition, the transition is always from high to low in terms of fertility. Okay, you don't find cities where fertility rates are increasing. Okay, at least not by large margin. In fact, nowhere in the world. In UK and Scandinavian countries, fertility has now started increasing, but from a very, very low base. Okay, so India is still, everywhere fertility is falling. But in terms of migration, Kolkata had huge migration in 1901. Today, not so much. Bangalore had very little migration in 1901. Today, a lot. Right? So migration keeps changing from time to time based on economic activities, political factors, etc. And so migration mainly based on human capital, wage differential, and as we'll argue in a bit, also gender. So if you look at this table, high, low, and sort of low, high, this is basically fertility on the y-axis, migration on the x-axis. We are actually going to see the data fitting this matrix. Okay. So this is a scatter plot of cities in India, fertility on the left, migration on the bottom. Okay. So you will find that there are some cities with extremely high internal growth, you would expect, right, because they have high fertility and low migration. This is stagnation, this is explosion, and this is external growth. Okay. So just to give you an example, these are each dot out here is a city. So this is Kolkata. Okay. Kolkata is a city with one of the lowest fertility rates in India. Okay. It's growing at 0.7% annually, very, very slow. There are wards in Kolkata which population are falling. It's unheard of. You can't think of wards in India where population falls. Right? Actual populations are falling. Then you have Surat on the other end, okay, growing at 5% per annum. Okay. You have Sambhal, which is near Moradabad in UP, at 2%. 2% is still above the national average of 1.5%. Okay, and that's entirely due to internal growth. And then you have an example like Bhubaneswar with relatively low fertility but high migration. So cities in India are growing because of these two major sets of reasons. And typically when we look at the urban discourse in India, it's almost as if migration is the only factor. Okay, in fact, studies on fertility in Indian cities are very, very scant. So we break this down further. We look at city growth in the last 10 years. What are the major factors driving? We find agglomeration effects. I'm going to skip this slide. So why does fertility vary across cities? Why does Kolkata have such low fertility? Why does Sambhal have very high fertility? So we look at fertility across literacy rates, human capital, okay, and we find the expected relationship that you would find in this fertility human capital literature of a very robust negative relationship. So again, each dot out here is a city, right, and you find this very nice negative slope. Okay, so regions with, and what's important to remember here is that human capital varies substantially in India. Right? So literacy is just one proxy. You can have other proxies, university education, etc. But from nearly 50 to 100%. Right? So there are cities in India which only 50% of the population are literate versus 100, or near to 100%. And this explains the fertility conundrum. Right? So human capital, and in the north relative to the south, the level of human capital is much lower. So the fact of the matter is that cities in the north are growing fairly fast, not because of economic dynamism, but precisely because of the lack of economic dynamism. Right? Precisely because there's no income, there's high fertility and there's high city growth. Okay, so it's a very interesting way of looking at city growth. If you look at fertility across Indian cities, so this is just a sort of city bubble. This is about 468 urban agglomerations of the recent 2011 census. You'll see Kolkata is the least shaded. Kolkata is on par with all these. I think you can barely see these dots. Very, very low fertility rates. Okay, this is the computed fertility index. You can map it onto total fertility rates. It's basically almost half. Okay, so cities in the south are growing much slower purely on account of having fertility rates nearly half of what they are in the north. Right, and of course you find some sort of regional variation. And this explains the fact what's happening right now, that cities and towns in the north are growing. The population of them is growing faster. This obviously matters because when you look at urban planning in terms of requirements for housing, transport, etc., the major variable is obviously a population forecast. Right? How big do you think the city is going to be? And what you're going to see is that cities in the south are growing much, much slower than cities in the north. Moving on to the sort of next point on migration. So we looked at fertility and what's causing that variation. So this will build on sort of work which I've been doing over the last 5 years. Most migration in India is not permanent. When I say migration, I mean migration for work. Okay? So most migration for work in India is not permanent, neither is it seasonal. So there are three categories of migration: permanent, seasonal, which is 2-3 months construction labor, etc. What we find, and this is in other published work, is that the bulk of the migration is what we call as semi-permanent. Okay? Which means that this person could spend up to 30-40 years of the person's life in cities, but will not settle down in the city. Okay? That person will go back. Okay. And this is closely linked with this phenomenon of remittances and the gender aspect. That is, the woman of the family, typically the wife of the male migrant, does not migrate with the man. Okay. Now, this is not an all India phenomenon, it's more prominent in the north relative to the south, etc. etc. But 80% of work related migration is men, compared to China, where it's about 55%. Now, this is very important because what the implication of this is that India has very large gross migration flows from rural to urban areas, but small net migration flows, because for every young male migrant coming in, an old male migrant is also going back. Okay. So, migration as a whole is fairly substantial, right? But when you look at the census data, you do find that migration seems to be very low. Okay. But that's because, and this is a methodological issue, if you go to many of these source regions like Azamgarh in UP, Ganjam in sort of Orissa, and you ask people, are you a migrant? As per definition, they are a migrant. They came from working in Delhi or Surat. So, their last place of residence has changed, right? But when you ask them, are you a migrant? They say, no, I am from this place. Right? So, a huge number of people in India, especially in the older cohorts, are reported, they should be counted as migrants, what are known as return migrants, but they are not. Okay? So, that is one sort of methodological issue in terms of migration data. And this explains also the sex ratio difference that we saw in the beginning. This is, the phenomenon of mass migration is not new. So, much of my work has been on the historical process of migration. This is a chart showing you sex ratios. Okay. So, Ratnagiri, Udupi, all of you heard of Udupi, the Udupi Bhavans of Bangalore, Bombay, etc. Sex ratios of Ratnagiri district, right? I think most of you heard of sex ratio. You know that India's sex ratio about 940, in Punjab it's very low, it's a bad phenomenon, Beti Bachao, the whole campaign. In Ratnagiri it's the reverse. Okay. It is a missing men phenomenon. There is a surplus of females. The sex ratio is above 1100, not in one census, two census, but from 1870. For 130 years, its sex ratio has never fallen below 1100. Okay, this is a phenomenon of what I've been referring to as the missing men phenomenon. Okay, and last November we did a survey in Ratnagiri, and there were absolutely fascinating stories as to how such a migration stream can be sustained over 4 or 5 generations. Udupi is another sort of district which comes in, but it's not just these two districts. So I have published a paper which shows that about 20% of India lives in regions which have experienced consistent, persistent mass migration over the last 100 years. Okay. The other regions I'll show you in a bit. This is just to give you sort of a flavor of the field work in Ratnagiri. This is a particular family, a photo taken in Chembur, which is a place in Bombay, when the whole family was there. And the family was there precisely because of the photograph. They wanted to take a photograph, there was no facility in Ratnagiri, so they went to Bombay to get the photograph. But otherwise, the women in this photo never migrated to Bombay. Okay. Whereas all these people, the sons, they grew up, the father came back, the sons went. Okay. So, this sort of persistence of migration is very great. This is just a map showing comparing urbanization, out migration. If you look at migration, so Ratnagiri is here, the black shaded line, so more than 25%. It's actually about 35% of households there have a migrant out for work. That's a huge number. That's mass migration, however you define it. Okay. Udupi is out here. Okay. But it's a large chunk of India. Okay. This is the entire Gangetic plain here. There is the Himalayan economy. I don't have data on Nepal, but it actually extends across Nepal. Okay. There is this massive missing men phenomenon in India, which gets reflected in the masculine cities that we live in. Okay. So, you have cities with extremely masculine sex ratios precisely because the men are away at home. Okay. You also have clusters in Tamil Nadu, coastal Orissa, etc. And so, where are these people moving? Okay. They are moving to some of the major centers. Okay. So, if you look at migration to major cities in India today, if you look at Mumbai, so Mumbai draws migrants from practically everywhere in the country. Okay. And this is data from 1990s. For reasons unknown to us, the census of 2011 has still not released the migration data. So, we still don't have information on 2001 to 2011. So, all this stuff is on 1990s. Right. So, it's slightly dated, but if you take the argument of persistence over time, then things would not have changed dramatically in the last 10 years. In Delhi, it's pretty much from the Hindi heartland. Right. So, people are migrating from here, but some clusters everywhere. In Kolkata, there's very little migration, and those who are coming are from a very immediate hinterland. Okay. In Surat, a city which I've done a lot of field work in, the migration from here is basically in the diamond industries, and there's one district here called Ganjam. Right? There's one district, literally thousands of kilometers away, not thousands, but yeah, about 1,500. This one district out here sends almost 1 lakh of migrants, right? 100,000 migrants, just one district, and none of these districts in between, okay, send any migrants to Surat. So this is a story of very strong migration networks, right, which have been sustained over a really long period of time. When I went to Ganjam, since I also do history, from Ganjam earlier in the early 20th century, people didn't go to Surat, they went to Burma. Okay, so Burma was the Surat of that time, right? So they all went to Burma, and then after Burma shut down, slowly you can actually see, they switched towards the west coast. In general, actually, much of the migration just taking place from here towards the east. So not just within India, they're going to Assam, they're going to Burma, Malaysia, Sri Lanka, and then Fiji and all these other places, South Africa, etc. Once the international sort of economy shut down after the First World War, they start migrating towards Delhi, Bombay, Surat, etc. Okay, but these migrations networks have sustained over time, very hard to break, and they continue to be male dominated in nature, which means the women are not going. Right? So it's a very important feature of India's urban growth for major cities. This is just to give you a flavor of Surat. Right? Surat is a city with almost 70% of its workforce is migrant. It's one of the largest in India. Surat is also India's last manufacturing metropolis in some sense. And this is a visiting card of a remittance operator. Okay, and when you walk in Surat, it's remarkable. You just find these remittance shops. And this was fieldwork in about 5 years back, so now things have changed. You have ATMs, etc. But you have a line of shops just in the business of sending back money home. And we talk to migrant workers, it's very clear from their sort of expectation that they are never going to settle in the city. Okay, and we'll have a sort of discussion on why that is taking place. So I'll conclude here that India's urbanization and urban growth is very, very closely linked with the nature of its demographic transition. Okay, it explains a lot of the sort of so-called mysteries that we called earlier. India is not urbanizing very fast because cities are growing fast, but villages are also growing fast. That's not happening everywhere. That's happening in a particular part of India, which we argue is because of stagnant agricultural yields. Now, you can ask me why are agricultural yields stagnant? We can have a discussion on that after. What we're calling as a demographic divergence is not the north-south divergence, it's the divergence between rural and urban natural growth rates within the north. Okay, so this divergence did not take place in the south. It's a divergence which takes place within the north. And it's a very important point because typically demographers, there are umpteen number of studies or books on the north-south divide. But this is a divide which is happening within the north. And because of higher fertility rates, cities in the north are now actually growing fast. Okay, so you have a city like Sambhal which is growing at 2% without any migration purely because of internal growth. In those growth cities, when I showed a chart on growth cities like Sambhal, Kolkata, etc. had very minor area changes or boundary changes. That is also a major issue in Indian sort of city data because Ahmedabad UA suddenly gets Gandhinagar in 2011. So automatically your population expands. So you need to also take into account area changes, and that's what we've done in this study. The second sort of conceptual term that we would like to use is a very special kind of urbanism, and lots of different kinds of urbanisms discussed by theorists in India. I don't think this feature has got enough attention, and it comes from a gender sort of component. The idea that, again, I would say it affects about 40% of urban India. Okay, so it's not affecting Bangalore so much. It's not affecting Hyderabad so much, but it does affect other places. Okay, it does affect some cities in the south, but mostly the major cities like Bombay, etc. And because of this phenomenon of male migration, low investment in the city, consistent sort of network with your source region back, you're sending back large money flows and investing all your savings, if there are any, back home. Right? You don't eventually get what economists call as the release of surplus labor. What you have is only a sort of cyclical release because people are coming in, but people are also going back. Okay, so there's a very strong gender component. The question is, why are women not moving? Right? If you look at China, one part of the answer is in terms of work opportunities for women in cities, much less in India compared to in China. The other part is also about mobility norms. When I interview migrant workers, I'll just give you a small example. On a factory shop floor, a synthetic textile factory shop floor in Surat, you have migrants from different states. You have migrants from Khandesh in Maharashtra, and then you have migrants from sort of eastern UP. And just a small sort of anecdotal incident, but the person from Bihar, he was celebrating sweets because he had a child back home in eastern UP. And I asked him, and the Maharashtrian migrants are there, very surprised that this fellow is not back home celebrating the birth of his child. And so that sort of led me to ask them, okay, so why are you here with your family? So the Maharashtrian migrants are moving with their family. Kids are also there somewhere around the factory. The wife is also there. Whereas this guy from, Eastern UP is not there. And that's very telling. It's telling you of some sort of a cultural norm going on at play. Because the Maharashtrian migrants from Khandesh cannot imagine moving without everyone in the family, right? Whereas if you go to Eastern UP, it's a norm that you grow up knowing that the men will go out and the women will not. So there are some very strong norms on female mobility which continue to take place. There are of course a lot of changes happening. There's clear evidence that female migration is rising, especially from Chhattisgarh and certain other parts of India. But at least my sense is that from these original hotspots, it continues to be male dominated. If you look at Kerala, Kerala, that's a very different story. So in Kerala, Kerala people are going to the Gulf mainly. 80% of Kerala's out migrants are men. Okay, and Kerala we know has phenomenal levels of sort of women empowerment relative to other parts of India. And so the question there is, why are only the men moving? Right? And the answer there typically that you get from migrant workers is that there's a destination region factor. Okay? You cannot get citizenship in the Gulf, so that conditions your migration strategy to be short term, 4 to 5 years based on contract. So only I will go so that I can minimize saving and I'll come back. Okay? So that's a very different explanation. But even there, most migrants are men. Okay? And so in some sense, cities like Dubai also feature in what we're calling as remittance urbanism, a city of migrants who will never settle there. And so thus, because of this interplay between demographic transition and urbanization, what we have is this paradox where you have rapid urban growth in the north, but slower urbanization because the villages are also growing faster, versus slower urban growth in the south, but rapid urbanization, relatively rapid urbanization. This obviously has implications on housing, transport, infrastructure, because population is one of the crucial variables that urban planners look at. So I'll stop here and look forward to questions. Hasn't started. Okay.
Thank you. That was a really interesting presentation, and I really like the way you kind of brought fertility into this discussion. I think you're right. It's just too much about migration, too much dominated by the idea of migration. I had a couple of questions. One is on, this hypothesis of agricultural yields and their impacts on fertility rates. I was wondering if you had tried to look at sort of other causal impacts, like agricultural surplus being, some states have these kind of historical trajectories of agricultural surplus being invested and therefore leading to urbanization. Because, from what I could understand, you're not necessarily saying that the causal linkage between rural fertility rates or natural growth rates and urbanization is in that direction and not the other way. So I was just curious if you had tried to look at other causal pathways. And the second thing I wanted to ask you was about your distribution of urban agglomeration population over time. And I really like the fact that you brought in this really long series, which is often very missing in some of these discussions. But I was curious how much the moving back to the left of that distribution is because you're looking at urban agglomerations and not the entire urban distribution. And I was just curious if you were able to look at that, because there's also base effects going on with urban agglomeration population. And we know that it's not rising as fast as it was, but when you look at the overall urban distribution, is it different?
Great, thanks. Yeah.
Thanks. That was a very, very nice talk. A couple of, so I wanted to partly ask the Shreya question and then just, I think one of the things that I find striking is that we're still kind of, when you're taking on myths, you're also keeping them alive, right? So every time we debunk a myth, we retell it. And so I'm very curious that I think in some ways what your thoughts are on the fact that our theories of economic impacts and trends in urbanization, right? Human capital theories, education level theories, there was a lot of time in the middle where we argued that those were entirely based on urbanization trends in the industrial north post-industrial revolution, right? So one question to me is, if we're thinking about southern urbanization trends, why are we still debunking the theories that were never told from here? And what would a completely different origin myth look like, right? So in one sense, what it may be a very different reading of the entire data story that you present, is that much of sub-Saharan African urbanization reflects exactly these patterns, right? Of employment dynamics, of large-scale urban growth with low levels of urbanization. So then instead of again saying here, India is different, actually it's not. Actually, if you look at southern urbanization, this is Lagos and Dhaka and Cairo and Algiers, right? It's just not New York, London, Paris, and Tokyo, but it never was. So in one sense, I think I'm also pushing you to sort of say, can we tell a different canonical story of what urbanization trends and myths we take on? So the myth is actually the northern post-industrial revolution urbanization. We are not the exception, because the danger in telling the story this way, and I'm completely convinced by it, is that we're still telling the story of us as an anomalous pattern of urbanization, because the trend, the standard we're measuring against is still not moved. Right? So part of me is pushing you to rethink that. So what if you tell our urbanization story along with the African urbanization story? Low human development, low human capital, massive centralized urban forms, and exactly the same question. We're looking for a different industrial urbanization that we're not going to get and we never had. So that's the one thing to consider. The second thing to think is, I'm curious about, I just want to hear more about, you switched a term. You went from masculine urbanization to remittance urbanism. Now, between urbanization and urbanism, there's a big conceptual leap, right? Because the idea of urbanism was very much not to look at trends or demography or form. It was to look at the composition of the meaning of being urban, of culture, of social struggles, of notions. So if remittance is meant to be urbanism, there's something also about urban culture and form and spatiality that is changing because of the remittance structure of the economy. So if it's conceptually going to play as urbanism, what does a city whose life and understanding itself as an urban culture and space, how does it change because it's a remittance-based economy, right? Because in one sense, every urbanization is a remittance urbanization. Right? So it's just a degree question, it's not a kind question, but urbanism suggests that it's a kind question and not a degree question. And my last line is, I'm just a thought, that I'm very provoked by this idea of missing men, right? Because they're obviously making a play, but the men aren't missing, we know where they are. Yeah. So the missing women are actually missing. So just a thought on the gender reading.
So it was interesting to note when you were talking female migration in a positive sense. You mentioned Chhattisgarh. And when we, think of it, and especially the cause of it, it's basically because of forced migration there, displacement, because the female or the migrants, if we look at the profile of those, they are basically domestic workers, domestic help, and these kind of. So I also wanted to understand, how do you see this? Yeah. Because to me, it's not very positive. Okay.
Yeah, great. Thanks a lot for these questions. So the first question on agricultural productivity and whether people, so other causal factors. So yeah, the storyline out here is that if your agricultural yield is a proxy for surplus, right? So surplus, and the idea is that surplus gets translated into wages. And that's a very robust fact in Indian labor economics, that there's a very strong link between agricultural productivity and rural wages. Because that link is very, very well established across the last 3 decades of research. And so what we are saying is basically with higher wages for even a laborer family, it has an income effect of having sort of lower kids. So it would be interesting, and this is completely, it's not 100% over this work. So I'm still open to sort of different, I think we can probably have a proper discussion, I think, after this. But for me, it's a very convincing story because it fits at least the empirical data very well. But I'm open to thinking as to how agricultural productivity translates into lower fertility without an income effect, right? So is it because surplus is invested outside in the cities, etc.? So that's something. But I'll just take your question in a different direction, because I got it, I've been getting it other places. So I'm saying agricultural productivity is, if it's good, then fertility will fall in rural areas, so it closes the divergence, and so urbanization will be faster. But if agricultural productivity is very good, then why should people migrate to the cities? Right? So it's also a potential negative drag on urbanization, because it could actually reduce migration propensities. However, in India at least, the data is there's a very mixed relationship. You would think that in poorer regions people migrate more. That's a myth. Okay, so if you saw that map carefully, the poorest state of India is Bihar. One of the richest states of India is Kerala. They have the same out-migration rates for work. Right? So it's a remarkable sort of paradox. Of course, from Kerala they're going outside India, and from Bihar they're going within India, but also outside India. In fact, UP 2 years back was the first time in the last 20 years that UP sent more migrants to the Gulf than Kerala. So those are the sort of migration there. So the link between productivity and migration is not very close cut, because Kerala has very high agricultural productivity, but it still has higher migration. So the driving factors of migration in India, wage differentials of course, networks, historically determined networks, but population density. What connects Bihar and Kerala is density. Right? So that density is an important sort of factor there. In terms of large cities, yeah, very good question. If you look at 350 UAs, and if you look at UAs in 2001, there will be a base effect. And if you look at a sample in 2001, you're precisely looking at the cities which have grown faster. So that's there. We do this for the entire distribution as well. Okay, and we find the same shift. Okay, so and you can see it, because if fertility rates are falling across the board, then because fertility is 50% of urban growth in some way, right? Natural increase is 50% of urban growth. So if fertility is falling, it has to have some pressure. So unless migration increases dramatically, you should be expecting this leftward shift of city growth distribution. So that's what we find in this entire distribution as well. Great points by Gautam. Completely agree that you're right that this is using an American framework and sort of seeing India as an anomaly and trying to fit the facts. Yeah, I mean, I should be open to the idea of seeing it the other way. I think that's the preamble of the new journal as well. So I should keep that in mind, definitely. In sub-Saharan Africa, however, I think things are slightly different in terms that they've also had a lot of conflict. So conflict-driven migration. Also, there's one paper which says that foreign aid, which was centered mainly in cities, got in a lot of people. So there were also some very specific factors in sub-Saharan Africa, which we don't really find in India, which propelled migration. So the anomaly there is basically you had urbanization without economic growth in sub-Saharan Africa, and some of the reasons are conflict and so on. But you're right that the gender component is still there. The migration in sub-Saharan Africa, like India, is very, very male-dominated in nature. So yes, I should reorient the sort of tone of this thing. On missing men, the idea is to make it catchy. They're obviously not missing. In fact, it's actually more about missing women in migration streams, right? So that is the real story. But the point is, the missing women phrase has wide salience. So I mean, for me to say missing women in migration streams in colon is a bit of this thing. But it's not my creation. Ashish Bose, the demographer, had an EPW paper called Missing Men and Lonely Villages in the Himalayan Region. So he's the first guy to actually use it, but I'm sort of pushing it along that path, precisely because I think it's important to have that phrase, because sex ratios in India have always been talked in terms of missing women, obviously because it's a serious issue, right? As you rightly said, they're not existent, right? They're actually missing. But there are large parts of India with female surpluses, okay, and they have their own unique dynamics, like Ratnagiri, Azamgarh in the relative sense. Even within Punjab, okay, you have a district like Hoshiarpur. Hoshiarpur is a district with large-scale outmigration for the last 100 years. If you see Punjab sex ratio, it's 800. Hoshiarpur sex ratio, 900. So even there's a relative impact, because there's sex-selective abortion, etc., happening in the lower age groups. But the minute you come to the working age groups, the men are missing. So, so I'm using missing men purely in contrast to highlight the fact that there is this other sex ratio issue in India as well. And question on displacement migration, again, very good question. much of my work on migration has been non-displacement in nature. So the honest answer is that I don't know. Right? And it's really difficult to understand displacement migration in India precisely because there's no good data. Right? So we really don't have good information. But at least from anecdotal information, in Bombay, for example, when I was in college, I used to do a lot of field work there. When you go to a lot of the slums, especially around TIS in Bombay, you find large number of migrants who have come because of project affected people and so on. And they're displaced not just once, but many times within the city as well. The gender component, however, okay, I'm not very sure. In the sense, I would imagine displacement migration to be fairly gender neutral. Now that's an open question, right? So you might say it is more female dominated, but then the question is, why have the men not moved? If they've been displaced from somewhere, why would you expect a sort of gender difference? So the quick answer is that I don't know, but I wouldn't expect a very big gender imbalance in displaced migration streams. Yeah. Any more questions? We still have, yeah.
And there's
Thank you for that. So my question is on the on that specific slide we just showed, where you showed the connection between Ganjam and Surat in terms of migration.
Yeah.
Given that you looked at it historically and that you also did fieldwork in Ganjam, I'm just curious, did you find any links between this trend and economic factors? Because you mentioned that earlier that they used to work in Burma and then the shift happened to Surat. I'm wondering if that shift is caused because there was some kind of compatibility in terms of sectors that they already worked in and they found some relation and some incentive to shift to Surat because of that.
Great. Yeah.
Yeah. Hi. Thanks for the talk. My point is basically our country, the beauty of our country is that we are a very culturally divergent country. So like you had one slide where you showed Tamil Nadu has progressed a lot over the years compared to the state like Bihar. Now if you look at the city like Chennai, we had these recent problems of these big floods and all. So somewhere the city planning and the urbanization was greatly blamed for the whole calamity which happened. One more problem about this urbanization is it gives a lot of employment to a lot of people, but it also lets more number of the poorer section also becomes increasingly high. So the hierarchy is like the rich is more as well as is the poor. So so somewhere cities like Alleppey and all, I don't think I will ever want it to see become like a city of Chennai or a city like Amravati. So is it always right to say that urbanization is a positive aspect, especially in an Indian context? Like, yeah.
Yeah, so this is with regard to that slide that you had, which visualized demographic divergence. Can you please switch to that slide for a moment? I had a thought while I saw this.
Long way back, but yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
The next one, the one with the districts.
Okay. Yeah.
So when I saw this map and not the legend, I can also sense that the districts which have a greater divergence are also the source districts for outmigration.
Okay.
And the ones that are lightly colored are the places that are hosting these migrants, in a sense.
Okay.
And a lot of your argument is based on the fact that demographic divergence is a more important contributor to urbanization rather than migration. But can migration be considered a function of demographic divergence?
Great. Yeah. Yeah.
So, I mean, I'm trying to get it. What I understood is, you showed us that taken discretely, urban areas are growing, fertility, migration, etc. And taken at a larger geography of India, growth in rural areas probably higher than the
Naturally
higher than the urbanized, the areas that are becoming urban. Right? Which is what
than the existing urban areas. Yeah.
Than the existing urban area.
Yeah.
Now, what is interesting to me there is two questions there. What is the real difference there?
What is the?
What is the real difference in that framing? That's one. Yeah, when you say de-urbanizing. So other than a trope of urbanization that comes from 70 years of urban theory, which is completely bundled with so many particular reasons, what is the real difference there? First one. Second, what actually motivated this particular exploration? What is the question that you're trying to answer by finding this particular difference? I mean, I'm not even convinced about the difference, so I'm hoping that you will help me understand that. But what motivated this? Yeah.
Any more questions? Yeah.
Thanks for the talk. Just a thought, not a question. So with your result, if I'm a politician from the north, I'm very happy because I don't want the literacy rate to grow. Literacy rate doesn't grow. My population increases. Men go out, work in the south, send remittance back. I have women in the villages. I'm pandering to their votes. So my electorate is clear. There's lowering of poverty because of remittance. And I don't want it to grow, so things remain same. So persistence would remain, right? So as a politician from the north, my priorities are pretty much clear. I don't want to provide them services because this serves me. It is persistent and will remain persistent, right?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, thanks for this set of questions. So the first question on Ganjam district. It's a very interesting story. It's very hard to pinpoint a particular factor. What they were doing in Burma is very clear. They were basically in the rice plantation. So Burma was the rice factory of the world in some way. So they were working on fields. Right? In Surat, and since I spent a lot of time in Surat, the first incidents of migrants from Ganjam coming there were, so now it's become a derogatory word, they call them Mali. And they were in the gardening sector. Okay, so actually the first occupation which people remember in their memory, when you ask them, what did your father come here as, and so on, in their local memory, right, gardening as a profession is there, right? So it could be just one or two people who went. These networks, the way they start are very mysterious, but once they start even slowly, they explode over time, right? So then everyone get your, your nephew, your cousins, everyone come, right? So I would say the occupational change was in a way from agriculture itself, from rice to gardening. So it's from like rural agriculture to urban agriculture in a very sort of strange way. They also have this interesting system called tappawalas who send money, and that's been a local mafia for the last 30-40 years in terms of sending money between these two places. The Burma closure was political. Indians were basically kicked out, and the biggest losers were the Chettiars in the south, and they lost a lot of assets and so on. So that contracted that network. But the migrants from Ganjam sort of could switch. The other factor about Ganjam, which I had not mentioned, and about many places in India, and this is of interest to people working on climate change, is that Ganjam, now it's in their local memory, virtually every 10 years there are 2 cyclones. So what's the point of doing agriculture if every 5 years everything is wiped out, right? So the local memory is very strong. So people ask me, why are you working in, and if you go to Ganjam, it's beautiful. It's very close to Chilka Lake, and why would anybody leave that and come? But you have a cyclone. So there's this very strong, you ask people from Bihar and there are floods. Right? So a lot of these natural things which not only determine seasonal migration, but in the long-term memory, it's very interesting. In Udupi, actually my father's side comes from Udupi. And when I asked my family, who are the first guys from Udupi? It is a very fascinating research question, right? They're all over. And there's a flood in the 1920s, very strong in the memory, in the local memory. And that flood, a massive flood in Udupi, started this massive migration. When you look at the data, we know that it started even before that. But at least in the memory, it's certain factors remain. About Chennai, I think the question is, urbanization is not always good and so on. So it's a very normative position. Either you think urbanization as in the share of population living in large urban settlements. There's this famous Gandhi versus Ambedkar kind of clash point. Gandhi advocating village life, Ambedkar advocating city life. So, you can trace back this debate many ways. But my normative position is very clear. It's on the Ambedkar side. So, that is there. Not to say that caste disappears and so on, but there's sort of other thing. But as a society as a whole, it's one of the strongest empirical regularities. Across the world, virtually every society has urbanized along with sort of changes in human capital and all these other sort of so-called development indicators. So in that sense, if you were the politician and said, I don't want to urbanize as a policy objective, which a lot of politicians in India have had, I would counter that. There's a very telling thing, when who was the chief minister of Karnataka before? Yediyurappa. He had met some Italian minister. I remember this newspaper article when I was studying here. And he said that for the first time in his life, they had a discussion and they said, and Yediyurappa said, they had said, okay, what percentage of your society works on agriculture? And Italy said something like 5%. And this fellow said something like 60%. And Yediyurappa said it with a lot of pride. Like 60% of our workforce works in agriculture. And that fellow said with a lot of pride that only 5% work. Right? So completely different ideological positions. But Yediyurappa went on to say that for the first time in his life, he realized that he was thinking on the wrong terms. That was his particular sort of ideological twist. About Chennai, really, I can't really talk about Chennai floods. Good point about this particular map. No, it's not related with migration. So, for example, entire West Coast is a migration hub. When we talk of Kerala, it's not just Kerala. It's the entire West Coast, south of Bombay. So, you have Ratnagiri, you have Sindhudurg, you have parts of Goa, you have not so much, but the coastal tracts of Uttar Kannada, then you have Dakshin Kannada, Udupi, Mangalore, and all of Kerala. So, entire Western Ghats, and I've written extensively elsewhere as to why this is in place. So, one side of Western Ghats, lot of migration, the other side, no. Okay, because this, again, history in terms of historic trade routes, migration networks, etc. Okay, so, and this is a fairly fertile tract in terms of agriculture. Madhya Pradesh, okay, has very little migration. Okay, in terms of what, if you saw the migration map, Madhya Pradesh is a big hole. Again, historic reasons. They were not close to the coast. The British didn't hire them. Right? So, whether if you see British recruitment practices, they were typically close to the coast or typically where famine struck. So, this is something which I've written on the historical aspect. You have the entire Himalayan states with fairly good agriculture, but a lot of migration. Okay, I mean, I don't know if you know Uttarakhand and Himachal. If you go to Delhi, a huge informal economy just coming from Uttarakhand. Okay, so it's not exactly the same. There's some overlaps, but not otherwise. On de-urbanization, so I think Jairaj, right? Jairaj, yeah. So it comes to the question of what do you think is urban? So, do you think urban is large settlement? So, it's a definitional issue. I know people out here have worked on this. For me, irrespective of definition. So, what's happening now when I say that natural growth rates are higher in rural areas, it is higher in a village settlement of 200 people in the north. It is higher in the village settlement of 1,000 people, higher in the village settlement of 5,000 people compared to the same, say, settlement size in the south. Okay, which means just hypothetically thinking, you have a city which is growing at 2% in the north, and the villages around them, okay, fairly distant from the city, are growing at 4%. So, in that region as a whole, right, though the city is growing at 2%, but the villages are growing at 4%, the region is de-urbanizing because more percentage of population is living in villages. Okay, the villages are growing larger, yes, but they are not reaching urban kind of characteristics, and this is occurring across settlement sizes. Okay, so that is one thing sort of you can see. Whereas in the south, you can see village settlements across settlement sizes growing at much slower rates than in the north. So regions are urbanizing faster in the south relative to the north because of just this village city difference in natural increase. Why am I doing this entire project is basically one paper written by a certain economist who say that there's no migration. Right? And they said that there's no migration. So they say, why is urbanization not happening in India as fast as one might expect? And their answer is that there's no migration, and there's no migration because of caste. And caste basically, like in China, you have the hukou system of sort of licensing migration. Out here, you have caste networks which sort of provide informal insurance to caste members. So if you move away to the city, you're losing that access. And hence, it sort of puts a drag on migration. Now, having talked to fairly large number of migrant workers, I know that it's not really that story. The story that you see in data and real life is the gender story, many more male migrants than women. So the question really bothered me that, okay, if you accept that India is urbanizing slowly, which I do, okay, you can have a different view based on, different definitions and so on. But actually, even with different definitions, you should not come to that view in my account. But what this research does then is to provide a non-migration explanation to this stylized fact of slow urbanization. Right? So, because again, actually what this research, this is how I started, and then along the way I realized fertility has just not been studied in the urban context and in this relative rural urban context. And so that's how I sort of worked more and more, and the history was just of sort of interest as a research area. So I think that's the journey of the particular idea. But I do think it's a very different way of looking at urbanization, in the sense that we tend to look at it from a purely migration perspective, but there are these other factors at work, these demographic transition factors at work. On Andali, yeah, I mean, if I understand the question correctly, so as a political economy sort of situation, there is no incentive for politicians to say invest in public goods. Right? That is, it's possible. I think it's possible, but there's also there are two things at work. When the migrants go back, they are going back from regions which are much better off. So they also bring back a lot of expectations. So in that sense, there's also a demand at work. So when the migrants are going back, they're saying, look, Bombay has all these facilities, you better give this to me as well. So whether it has happened or not is, I think, outside this discussion, but there is also, I would say, another force at work, that is what is known as social remittances. Right? So ideas and behavioral patterns moving back. So for example, now you might want to, you might not approve of open defecation because you're used to a toilet in Mumbai. Okay, so you might have a demand for toilets. That could happen.
And these things, especially since women are the majority who primarily vote, should increase over time.
Correct.
Because their demand for this would be much more higher than that.
Correct, yeah. So actually that's an interesting way of looking at the prohibition of alcohol in Bihar, precisely because there's missing men, so the women votes matter. And yeah, I think that's sure.
Okay, there's one final question and we'll close after this.
Just two questions. The presence of large number of females and women in the migration data is often explained as migration due to marriage. So once you take that into account, how does it bear on your final argument? And the second question is that what do the migration numbers look like for towns within the source region on the
Great
chart
point.
that you
Yeah.
showed for especially what you were saying earlier about most of the growth happening within corridors between Chennai and Bangalore.
Great point, yeah. Yeah, two excellent questions. I'll start with the second one. In regions with mass out-migration, like Ratnagiri, so which is the slowest growing town of India over the last 100 years, it's Ratnagiri. Okay, the town of Ratnagiri is the slowest growing town of India, at least in a large sample of cities of India. And it's not easy to understand why. Firstly, how does a town grow? Typically, you have a local hinterland. They are not going to, so people around Ratnagiri town are not going to Ratnagiri town, they're going to Bombay or now the Gulf. Right? So Ratnagiri doesn't get that catchment source. The people from the Ratnagiri town themselves are moving to Bombay or other places. If you look at towns in many parts of India, if you look at Kerala also, right? Out migration rates are, yes, higher in rural areas, but there's a lot of out migration from urban areas as well. Okay, so there is, if you look at towns with migration, Patna is growing fairly well because of fertility, but because of migration, nobody is coming to Patna, okay, and some people are leaving Patna, okay, but not so much to dampen the fertility effect strongly. Just like I think I showed that one chart of different sort of city, quadrants, and that's, I think, useful to sort of, yeah, this kind of a framework to understand why some cities grow. So you'll have a town like Ratnagiri, which is somewhere here, okay, that is fairly low fertility now, okay, but no migration. In fact, some towns have net out migration, which means that they'll have very, very small growing populations. One thing we've not talked about much is the area change, and that's an important point. Okay, a lot of like Mallapuram in Kerala, its population grew by 25% annually between 2001 and 2011. Its area also grew by 21% annually, from something like 50 square kilometers to 800 square kilometers. So that's a huge issue as to how you actually define an urban area, etc. But we've done robustness checks here. We do an entire analysis with the entire sample. We then break down the sample into towns which did not have large area changes. So whether you had area changes or not, all the sort of analysis still works. On marriage, very good point. Virtually every adult woman in the census is a migrant, because if you move on marriage, and if because of village exogamy, which means you move from one village to another, in the census you're considered as a migrant. But if you look at rural urban migration, most are men. Okay. There's still, of course, when you look at non-work related migration, I've written about this. There is a data issue. You ask a family the reason for migration, the man will say work. Woman might be working in the city, but she will say marriage or move with the family. So yes, if you look at migration for work, automatically it becomes more male dominated. So I've done one thing on looking at households controlling for this. So you look at households with the male migrant, classify the woman as a migrant worker if she's working, but she's given the answer as moved with husband. Even then the number of migrant workers is overwhelmingly male dominated. So when you include migration or marriage migration or moved with partner, it doesn't really change this story. Yeah.
So we did one survey, particularly on that question and about the difficulty with data. So with the responses to most of our question pertaining to reasons for migration were not like as simple, either marriage or not, because most of the explanation that they would give would count as fairly economic in reason. For instance, so we migrated because of education of our children back home.
Correct.
Or something similar.
Yeah.
So at that, it became hard to classify it as migration due to marriage or not.
Correct. Yeah. So I think, there are definitely data issues involved here, but the fact that overall you have a number called the sex ratio. So this is one debate on the reasons of migration. But if you look at the sex ratio of these cities, Surat has a sex ratio of 690. So obviously there are many more men in Surat than women. So sex ratio is and not just sex ratio, but working age sex ratios is one useful way of looking at it. So see, Bangalore, Hyderabad they do have declining sex ratios because of relatively more male migration in recent years, but they still have sex ratios around 900 plus. Right? So in that sense, remittance urbanism is not a major feature of these cities, but it is a major feature of Surat, of Kanpur, of Delhi, of Mumbai, Kolkata to some extent, and so on. Great, thank you so much.
Thank you guys for coming, and please, follow us, Facebook, Twitter, and all the modern social media things.